Okay, here we are. Hey, Bunker Labs. Welcome to the All In. This is a town hall for our Equip piece for our All In campaign. We are all in for you as entrepreneurs to help you continue to move forward during this time. I am really excited about our session today and our guest and our facilitator, which is Bunker Labs founder, Todd Connor. Welcome, Todd.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you so much. And we're really excited to have with us Doug McCormick. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Jameson, our Chief Marketing Officer, for their terrific work and really speaking to the needs of the community. So I'm excited about today's conversation. We've got with us Doug McCormick, who is a managing partner of HCI Equity Partners, which is a private equity firm based out of Washington, D.C. Doug is also himself a Army veteran, West Point grad. I think that the notorious class of, what was it, 1986, Doug?
Oh, come on, 91. Don't make me older than I am.
91. Thanks for the correction. 91. And is a phenomenal leader in the veteran space. He's also served on the board of Team RWB, and he currently serves as the board chair for Bunker Labs. So has lots of context for what's happening in the private equity space, in the veteran space, and in the markets in general. So Doug, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Sure, man. Happy to be here.
Good. So just quickly, for those that may not be familiar with either your background or private equity, can you just kind of tell us in layman's terms what you do for a day job?
Sure. So I essentially manage money. Private equity is an illiquid asset class. So my investors are mostly foundations, pension funds, endowments, insurance companies, and they're giving us capital to invest over a long time period. And we are investing in private companies, and the general thesis is that investors get paid for that illiquidity, but also that as a private equity investor, which has control rights because we generally own more than a majority of the business, we have the ability to implement a strategy that can bring more value to the business and ultimately the investors. So it's a long-term strategy, very much focused on business building.
Fantastic. So you've got deep connections in terms of what companies that are taking outside investments are facing, what they're dealing with, as well as what entrepreneurs, or rather investors, are sort of looking at and seeing in this moment. And we'll try to kind of touch on both those things. So can you provide a framework maybe for entrepreneurs to think about, interpret the impact of COVID-19 on their businesses? And I sort of think about that in terms of three dimensions. So there's the economy, there's the markets that they're in, and there's also the availability of capital. But can you maybe tee up for us just how you're thinking about this in a way that might be helpful for the entrepreneurs?
Sure. I think that one of the key takeaways is the ubiquitous nature of the way this is impacting all of those markets at the same time. And so no one is escaping this scenario. So from an economy perspective, let me be clear, there's real damage being inflicted here based on, what this disease or this health scare issue is doing to the country. And I think most people have already taken off the concept of a V, recovery, a V-shaped recovery. I think this is going to be a longer, return to normalcy. From a markets perspective, when I say markets, I think more capital markets. So you look at the public equity markets, I think volatility is here to stay as the market grapples with digesting this information, understanding what it means to people in the longer term. And we're also seeing tremendous disruption in kind of the credit markets in terms of availability of capital. And I think I think there's some good news to that, which is I think the Fed has done some amazing things to ensure liquidity in the marketplace, ensure that banks are lending. But from an entrepreneurship perspective and what I would characterize as risk capital, I think that the risk markets are still shut down. And so I think anybody that thought they were closing on a round of, venture capital here in the last month, my sense is that is not the case. And folks are going to have to think creatively about how they finance their businesses in the near term.
Mm-hmm. Picking up on that thread, so if an entrepreneur, so we're considering for purposes of this conversation kind of venture capital dollars as risk capital, what would be the signals that you think entrepreneurs would begin to see if like when will the conditions begin to shift? Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball, but what would you be looking for to begin to say, that the conditions are beginning to shift? What do you think investors are going to need to see?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty fundamental about what is the course that this pandemic takes, and I think it's kind of naive to for any of us to think we can predict that. But I think having a thesis around what a scenario could look like where the investor begins, or the people can begin to make sound choices about what's going to happen and the impact of the economy. And so I think you've got a couple months at a minimum for the cards to turn over in a way that people can start to predict with some degree of clarity about what's going to happen. And in many cases, in my mind, the unknown is worse than the known, right? Even if it's known and it's not good, you can manage around it. And right now, I think we're just in such a time where we've never dealt with this kind of circumstance in modern history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What sort of zooming out a little bit. So that's a little bit about timing and risk capital. What advice do you have broadly for entrepreneurs that are navigating kind of these challenging times?
So the older I get, the more I kind of try to go back to just basic principles. And first of all, I would say I think veterans are particularly well positioned to deal with this kind of challenge because it's really crisis management. And so, I think there are a couple key themes or principles that I am talking to with my partners. The first is, mission first, people always, right? You got to do what's right for the business, but don't forget, people are the core to your success today and tomorrow. And if you're not making them part of the solution or an important part of the consideration, you're missing the game. The second is, in any crisis, kind of over communicate. And I think that goes to every aspect or constituent that you may deal with: suppliers, employees, customers. I think there is a real tendency to sugarcoat things in times of crisis. And so I think people that can be a realist and be very direct about how bad things are will help you maintain your credibility in a challenging time. And I think everybody knows it's bad. So kind of rip the Band-Aid off, be direct, and bring your constituents under the tent, if you will, in terms of how you're dealing with those problems. The advice that we're giving our portfolio companies is plan for the worst and hope for the best. And I think in this environment, the consequences of not taking action sooner are much worse than the consequences of taking action that's too aggressive and then bringing back resources as you get good news, right? So we would rather overcompensate and be well positioned for the more severe scenario, and then try to catch up because we've impaired ourselves from the growth that we may see in the future. I also think that this kind of environment is a time that will test people's principles, and so how you treat customers, how you treat employees, how the foundation of the company's culture. I think these are very trying times for some of those principles, and so just being committed to stay true to those, I think, is a real key part of this journey. And I think the last one would be find the silver lining, and that's hard to do right now. But the reality is, organizations that get through to the other side and persevere the challenge will have better capabilities. They will have learned a lot, and they will be arguably better positioned on a go-forward basis. So, not to make light of this challenge, it's significant, but I think it also represents an opportunity to redefine yourself, or really be introspective about how you can do better.
Mm-hmm. You talk about silver linings. Let me just pick up that thread for a second. And you kind of allude to some of these things, but the notion that it's in moments like these that you can create loyalty with your employees, depending on how you treat them, or create loyalty with your customer set, or re-envision the business. I mean, how do you help entrepreneurs who are sort of in panic mode think about finding those silver linings?
Boy, I tell you, I think it's different for every person. So I think you brought up two things. The first is just an acknowledgement that as an organization, you have a set of values, and just by staying true to those values, I think you often differentiate yourself in the marketplace because others will not in difficult times. And then in terms of how to become a better business, I just think, there's a lot of scar tissue that's going to be created through this as people make really hard decisions about how to navigate, the next 3 to 6 months. But that also is a tremendous learning opportunity. And again, if you can, bring your key employees into that conversation in a way that they're part of the conversation, they're learning from the, collective decision-making process. I think that's super valuable.
Great. What advice, that's entrepreneurs, what advice do you have for maybe small business owners who are dealing with the financial distress because of the impact of COVID? You've written about personal finance. There's obviously liquidity issues for most small business owners now, and many of them have their own personal assets tied up in the business. What advice are you giving them?
Yeah, I think first of all, just from a personal finance perspective, I think in a time like today, liquidity is really important as you think about whether you're going to invest in the markets or whether you're thinking about investing in your business. Is do you have the liquidity to stay the course, right? And from a business perspective, what I find is that managing a business in normal course is very different than managing for cash flow, right? And so what I mean by that is if I'm trying to create value in a business, I'm an investor, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm making decisions that in the long run should maximize my growth of my net income or my EBITDA, and that's how I'm allocating resources. And in the short term, it's all about cash flow management, and that is just a very different kind of thought process. So, for example, I spent a lot of time in the distribution segment, and in that market, as soon as this started happening, we immediately looked at, okay, how do we manage working capital? Because in the near term, working capital drives cash flow. So step number one is look at all your inbound purchases and think about how to delay or cancel those based on a new set of demand parameters. Then you think about accounts receivable, right? Generally, accounts receivable kind of come in on a pretty steady flow based on the size of the business. In today's environment, in the next several months, that is not at all the norm. And so thinking about how your customers may react to this situation, what the likelihood of payment is for you, that's a real critical aspect. And then we kind of go to the income statement and think about, what are the big sources of spend? Generally, it's cost of goods and it's employees. And how do we think about managing those in the near term as well? And I think, we've really pushed amongst our investment portfolio companies to develop what we call a 13-week cash flow. And it's very tactical. So unlike, a budget, which starts with an income statement, and then you build a balance sheet and a cash flow statement around that income statement assumptions. In a cash flow forecast that's done on a weekly basis, it's tactical of who am I collecting from this week? Who am I paying from a vendor perspective this week? When does payroll hit? And so, you start to lay it out that way, and all of a sudden it presents to you the very tactical decisions you have about allocating scarce resources to think about, how you're going to perform in the next month, in the next 2 months, and in the next 13 weeks. And I think it also then allows you to start thinking a little bit longer term. So how do I think more long term about some of my other commitments, whether it be rent, whether it be interest expense to a bank, whether it be loan principal repayment. And I think, in this environment, again, being proactive and over communicating to those constituents is also, I think, an activity that will serve you well.
We're getting some questions coming through. So if folks are watching this and you have a question for Doug, please tee it up and we'll try to take it on. I want to kind of go back to some of the things, your observations about sort of the 13-week cash flow look, which I think is an interesting kind of paradigm for small business owners. And maybe it's too soon to know this, Doug, but what do you think this will change in your go forward thinking about how to source companies for investment or look at deals, or will it? I mean, what in your mind has maybe changed on a permanent basis? Would you be looking for less sort of future state, debt obligations, or I don't know, what will change in your view?
That's a great, well, it's interesting. I'm not sure this is so much a change, but it's an interesting, observation. I think we've been long in the cycle for a long time. So lots of people have been saying for a period of time that, the economy is going to take another cycle, as it naturally does. And so I think investors in my business have been very defensive in the kind of businesses that they've they've pursued. I think the interesting thing is in some cases, those strategies haven't translated into being well insulated. So for example, food service has been a very traditionally stable end market, and today it's in disarray, right? So I think that one of the takeaways for me is just, again, humility. This is the, fourth cycle I've seen in my professional career, and every one of them looks very different. Every one of them, you would have thought from the previous cycles you would have anticipated. And, it always just seems to be a little bit different, and it catches a lot of people off guard. So in some ways, I think the key lesson is, diversify and prepare for these kind of outlier events by not placing all your bets in one basket.
Interesting. What are you seeing as we begin to sort? We're obviously coming into a harder period before we begin to sort of emerge into a period of opportunity. But I do want to look forward a little bit and ask: are there opportunities that you would see amidst this environment or coming out of this environment? There's speculation that lifestyle trends like work from home will be, in some cases, the new normal. What would someone, an entrepreneur or an aspiring entrepreneur who's kind of sitting this one out, what are you looking at as maybe future opportunities that could emerge from, what's otherwise a tough time?
Yeah. So from an investor perspective, I think there are a couple things that are going to be interesting over the next kind of 12 to 18 months. The first is, I'm a big believer that the investments that are made in the next, 3 to 9 months are going to be exceptional in retrospect. And that's always the way it is, right? It's a very challenging time. Everybody's questioning, the traditional rules of how we allocate capital. And so it's that classic, be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. I think we're in that time where people will be really well compensated, to put capital to work here in the next 12 months. Having said that, I think in the private markets, it takes a lot longer for that to play out, right? And so in the public markets, you've seen massive corrections on a daily basis as the market reacts real time to new information. In the private markets, I believe we're in an execution phase, and the consequences of those decisions won't really show up in the financing markets for another 3 to 6 months. So for example, lots of businesses right now are dramatically reducing their cost position. They're managing working capital to generate maximum cash flow for the next 3 months or 6 months to ensure that they can, navigate the choppy waters ahead. At some point, things will get better. They'll start to grow again. They will have used their working capital to fund losses probably, and they're going to need new growth capital to execute their growth strategy. Right. So I think there's a lag here in the private markets where the needs haven't presented themselves yet because people actually have to run the business, burn through the liquidity, if they're going to avail themselves to the PPP loans, take advantage of those, et cetera. So I think the activity time, for my market is much kind of more back end loaded in this year, kind of second half of the year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little bit about the PPP and your perspective on that. Someone asked a question about globalization and what does this mean for kind of global considerations? Do you think the events that we're seeing unfold further globalize the supply chain and demands, or does it actually, in some ways, create more of an impetus for sort of CONUS-based activities? How are you thinking about globalization in this context?
I think we're so far down the path on globalization, there's no turning back. And so I think we are in a world of interdependency where supply chains, are going to be global, and you've got to plan that way. Having said that, I see, I have a bunch of businesses that have global supply chains, and I see customers more willing to acknowledge that contingency planning is of real value, and having, kind of diversification in the supply chain, even at a higher cost, can be prudent, right? So I see more appetite for sourcing things out of Mexico. I see more appetite of sourcing some amount of product out of the U.S. in addition to, traditionally low-cost markets like China. So I think there's a rethinking of the supply chain, still a commitment to globalization, but an acknowledgement around contingency planning, safety stock, minimal viable diversification.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there was, generally speaking, going to be more of a tolerance for some slack in the system, or will that be a short-lived trend, or is the new normal that we want more slack in the system, or do you think that we'll kind of revert towards, the pre-depression efficiencies that we were at?
I generally think the slack in the system is not very well tolerated, right? Very few organizations run with profit margins where they can afford to, or they get compensated to manage for that outlier event, right? So it's interesting. You think about the N95 mask challenge, right? Like, my view is practically it's just very hard to scale a business that quickly to satisfy that demand. And so the only practical solution is you've got to have, significant safety stock. And, organizations and countries need to be willing to commit to that kind of investment, acknowledging that, 20 times out of 21, you're not going to need it, right? And so I think, thinking about those kind of investments in the context of insurance is really the right way to evaluate it.
And some would say that, that's kind of the role that the federal government's coming to play right now, is to sort of, put the slack in the system or finance some of that slack. You mentioned PPP. What's your, let me ask two questions. One is, like, are your companies participating? Are you seeing participation with it? And what's your advice to entrepreneurs that are maybe looking at that as an opportunity? So without asking a political question, what's your view of the instrument, and how should folks be thinking about it?
First of all, I'd say it's an imperfect instrument, but in a time of crisis, in a time of need, and a time where many companies, their fate depends on getting this liquidity relatively quickly, I think it's serving the purpose. And so I think the fact that the program was put together on such a quick time basis and is being implemented, I think is a real positive development. So some of our companies do qualify, and so if they qualify, they're applying. And I think it's a really important tool for entrepreneurs, small business owners across the board. And in general, my view is if you think you're eligible, you should apply, because I think there's still a lot we don't know about the next 3 to 6 months, and from a risk mitigation perspective, I think it's the prudent thing to do.
Okay. So we've got some questions that are coming in. I'll read a couple of these verbatim. This one you alluded to a little bit, but we always hear that cash is king. And when it comes to making decisions about how to spend the cash, i.e. dipping into business savings, using a line of credit, applying for SBA relief programs, which you just acknowledged, is there any rule of thumb for how much cash liquidity a business should have on hand? For example, in personal finance, you hear that you should have 6 months reserves. You mentioned the 13-week kind of framework for your companies, but anything else that you would say on that?
Boy. I would tell you, in this environment, if you have, well, first of all, I think let's define cash on hand. Cash on hand could be cash in the bank account, also revolver availability. So many people have small, credit facilities, et cetera. I would look at both of those as relatively fungible. I would say best practices amongst the businesses that I work with is if they have that revolver availability, they've actually drawn down on it already, right? There was at some point, I think this is diminishing, but some concern that the banks may struggle with providing the liquidity. And so a lot of folks have fully exercised their undrawn revolver capability to maximize their cash on hand. So that's point one. I think in terms of how much cash on hand you need relative to your expenses, that's really a byproduct of how much visibility do you have in your income statement, and specifically your revenue cash collections. And if you've got, for example, some kind of business where you've got long-term contracts in place, where you've got some predictability, I think you can afford to operate on several months cash flow on hand. If you are in a situation where you don't have much profile, then I think more cash on hand is obviously better. I think the good news in this environment is businesses that are contracting rapidly are actually generating cash, right? Because if they're able to collect their accounts receivable in the short term, they're in a position where they can manage by liquidating the AR. And again, I think the challenge is when you get back to growing, you're going to have to fill that hole back up.
Mhm. This is maybe a variation of the same question, but if someone's a small business owner with maybe a few employees, and they're looking at sort of the time horizon of this crisis, and there's a lot of unknowns, we're hearing from a lot of folks that they're not sure whether or not to keep the business going. How would you, do you have a perspective or a framework that you would offer for someone that's wondering, do I continue to put personal resources into this thing, get the PPP, do what I can to sort of create liquidity, or is the better, smarter move in this moment to just walk away from the business? How would you help folks think
Yeah,
about
again,
that?
I think it's so facts and circumstances dependent. I don't know that I have specific advice, but I would say the PPP is a zero cost option, right? So I would absolutely apply for that, get the proceeds. For the PPP loan to be forgiven, there are certain obligations in terms of keeping the employee payroll at a certain level, et cetera. But in my mind, if you have access to that tool, you should absolutely use it, manage it in a way that you maximize the benefits to the company, and that buys you time to evaluate the prospects for the business, but also what's happening in the market. We kind of a little bit ago talked about, we really are in an unknowable position right now, right? So to be able to forecast what is happening, how this is going to play out, I think is really challenging because it depends not only on COVID, but U.S. response, other government responses. But I think in 60 days, 90 days, there's a lot of information that, we collectively are going to get in all those things, right? Government response, as well as kind of the way the COVID virus evolves. And so I think, by buying yourself a month or two, you've availed yourself to a lot more information to make a better, more informed decision.
Right. We got a question related to this question of sort of indicators of the future. Someone in the Launch Lab group asked, how do you measure business confidence for customers to start making buying decisions? Is the stock market a leading indicator of the reboot and recovery for entrepreneurs and small businesses, or are there other indicators that we should be looking at?
First of all, I absolutely think the stock market is a leading indicator, and I'm struck personally with, I see the positive traction the market's had over the last week or several weeks, and I contrast that with where I am in our own business cycle planning, where we are in the process of managing cash flow, taking out cost, and so it's interesting to me how we're executing the hard things that the market kind of digested, if you will, a month or so ago, and now is kind of looking beyond that. So I think the market is absolutely a leading indicator. One thing that I'm seeing that is interesting, I'm not sure how to translate it into a forecast, but most cycles, they seem to go sequentially. You look at GDP contraction, you look at unemployment, and it's gradual, right? Gradually declining. And the speed with which this has happened has never happened in the past. So, over the last 3 weeks, there's been 17 million applications for unemployment insurance. Last week was the largest on record at like 6.8 million. And so I think that the economy has adjusted down at a speed that we've never seen before. And one encouraging sign that some of our businesses, we're seeing like drop and then relatively constant off of a low base, as opposed to continued contraction. So I think in my mind that's a relatively positive sign that there's some baseline of demand, and a lot of the contraction has been a byproduct of shelter in place.
Mm-hmm.
I would say on the negative side, a lot of the stock market performance and the economic performance, I think, has been consumer confidence driven. And I think this whole, the time we're in today, I think, is very challenging for the consumer on a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is this the volatility? Because the volatility over the last several weeks has been sort of extraordinary. We're hitting, new highs and new lows. Is there just a heightened tolerance for this level of volatility? Do you think this is
by whom? By whom?
I don't know. I guess that's the question from investors. I mean, if folks that have their retirement tied up in the markets.
I don't think there is new tolerance, and I think that's why you've seen dramatic retail sales. I think a lot of investors have essentially concluded one of two things: A, they couldn't handle the volatility, or B, they had more risk exposure in the portfolio at the end of the year than they had anticipated. And so I think, some of the market moves have been, retail investors kind of revisiting their risk tolerance, if you will.
Great. We have a few more questions here, Doug, and then I know that you've got a time horizon that's limited. But what was the biggest professional lesson that you learned coming out of the 2008 recession? So you talk about how there aren't necessarily portable lessons across these episodic recessionary moments in your experience, but did something shift for you, or did something that you learned in 2008 carry forward?
Yeah, I think it's confidence to be a contrarian. Like we talked earlier about some of the best investments that have made in the last decade were made in the depths of those challenges. And so, having conviction in your thesis, or conviction in your abilities to take those risky bets, I think is an important lesson. The second is I'm more and more a believer that in the long run, investing is as much about building good teams and implementing a good strategy and building a long-term business that you're proud of, that another buyer would pay a premium for, as it is the traditional tools of investing, valuation, financing, some of those things. And so I think the private equity market is an interesting market in the context of it's really a combination of business building, entrepreneurship, and management combined with investing. And my experience has told me that the long-term success is as much or not more driven by what are you doing with the business after you buy it, as opposed to just did you buy it.
Mm-hmm. For small business owners or people that want to be entrepreneurs coming out of this moment, do you expect? What do you expect once we move beyond this moment? What's your forecast around the ability to access debt capital? And do you think that the banks have a different posture around how they've, for the last 10 years or so, thought about small business lending, startup lending?
Good question. So I think there are lots of reasons to be positive, right? So we talked about a forecast and how this is maybe not forecastable. Having said that, we have a thesis that we put forward as this is what we believe is going to happen, right? So my own thesis, again, not predictive, but a thesis that is grounding our decisions, is that we're going to see, dramatic improvement by mid to late May. We may find that this is a virus that returns in the fall, but in the long run, our healthcare system is very good at rapid testing and coming up with a vaccine. So, while we may have a lot of uncertainty in the next 12 months, there's probably not a lot of uncertainty in, months 12 in perpetuity. So I think that insight is valuable in and of itself. And I think, American business has never been more innovative, never been more responsive. And so I think businesses are reacting. The quality and information is allowing businesses to react faster than they ever have before. And so while I think the contraction's been dramatic, I think the stimulus has been significant. And when, the virus starts to seed, I can see a scenario where, people are confident enough to get back to work pretty quickly.
Great. I want to shift gears a little bit, and we've had you in the hot seat around some of these finance questions, but honestly, your insights on this are really productive to listen to. So I appreciate you sharing them, Doug. What's shifting gears a little bit? So you sit on the board of obviously Bunker Labs, and have in the past been on the board of Team RWB and other veteran efforts. What does this moment mean for the veteran nonprofit landscape? Are there takeaways that you would share from that perspective?
I think, a couple. First of all, and some of this is just a byproduct of the way I, view my role at those organizations and the philanthropy community. But in many cases, those organizations, a lot of the tools that businesses use to grow and drive impact, these philanthropies use to grow and drive impact, right? So as you think about that, I think the advice I gave in terms of how to manage a crisis, mission first, people always over communicate, stay true to your principles. Those apply in the philanthropy space, absolutely 100%. And on the tactics, they also apply, right? Cash flow management, 13-week cash flow forecast. What's happening to my receipts? What are my outflows? And do I have enough liquidity to get to a more stable environment? Those are essential as well. I think from a long-term trend perspective, organizations that are well positioned to engage virtually and support the community virtually, I think they have been thriving absent this. I think this event accelerates the acknowledgement that venue and that way to engage the community is cheaper, more efficient, and the user community is rapidly developing a preference around those kind of engagement methods.
Yeah, great. Doug, I'll ask the last question and invite you just to offer any parting thoughts. But are you an optimist? Are you pessimist? How are you feeling in this moment? And then any parting thoughts you have?
Yeah, no. So I'm an optimist, and so I'll translate that to my own investing activities. I've not sold anything. I've continued to put money in. I've regretted that I put money in too early. So I missed it. I underappreciated how impactful the virus was going to be on the economy and the markets. But I think, the question, if you're willing to be an investor, then you've got to be willing to have the duration where you can hold it for 3 to 5 years. And in my own view, when you think about it in that time horizon, we all have lots of reason to be very optimistic. So I'm optimistic as an investor, and I'm optimistic as a human. I think this has been really challenging for all of us. There have been some silver linings in terms of the way we interact with one another that I'm excited to see. And I think in 3 to 6 months, we're going to be in a place with a lot more knowns, and knowns provide people with the context to make good decisions.
Great, terrific. Doug, thanks so much for being with us. We always appreciate your insights. We'd love to have you back in time as the situation unfolds. But
yeah, appreciate the questions and appreciate the opportunity. And the Team RWB guys have a tagline which is "Born for the Storm," and I think kind of veterans fall into that category. And so, in some cases, these situations bring out the best in people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll keep talking here at Bunker Labs about how we are going to be all in for the entrepreneurial community, for the military connected community, both to ride out this storm, get access to the government resources and other things that are available. And then the conversation I'm really looking forward to, maybe it's in 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, is how do you seize the opportunities on the other side of this? So we'll be having all of those conversations in time. But thank you again, Doug. And Liz, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Todd and Doug. That was a great conversation. If you have more questions around this subject matter, please feel free to post them in the comments, and we will get to them and answer them to the best of our ability, or find somebody that can. There are still some questions coming in. Also, this is a nice complement to our next town hall, which will be on Tuesday, April 14th, with JP Morgan Chase. So this will be another kind of continuation of this conversation for cash flow management to apply to your business. So we hope that everybody has a good, safe, and healthy weekend, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.